Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I'm joined by my friend and colleague Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. Good evening, Gordon.
Good evening, John.
From the Book of Proverbs, you made a present to me many, many months ago, Gordon.
Many moons ago.
Many moons ago, yes, correct. Mid-harvest...
Mid-autumn festival.
Mid-autumn festival, harvest moon.
That's right.
And you pass a mooncake to me with a secret message inside.
That's right. This has happened in ancient Chinese history where subversives wishing to overthrow a dynasty would bake messages in mooncakes, and one plotter would pass them along to another.
I go to the message in the mooncake that I'm baking to pass to Gordon tonight. It's a Chinese proverb. I can't do it in the correct language, so I'll read the English translation. Just as when striking a snake, first strike it on the head, so to catch a thief, first catch their chief. That's my proverb for the night. We turn to our colleague, Rick Fisher of the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Rick, a very good evening to you. Air Force General Herbert J. Hawk Carlisle, who is commander of the Pacific Air Forces, speaking most recently, underlining facts about the Pacific Basin region. If you strike a snake, strike it on its head, catch their chief. And the chief of the troublemaker in the Pacific region, well, what country could that be? In any event, what I learned from the general's presentation, Rick, is that the Navy and the Air Force are moving a majority of their military force to the Pacific. The Navy is deploying 60% of its warships to the region. What's happened, Rick? What's going on? What future is anticipated? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John, and thank you again for having me aboard. The American military is shifting to the Pacific because our allies, our 5 treaty allies in Asia, want the Americans to be far more engaged, far more present, and far more active to deter Chinese aggression. The Navy is in the process, hopefully it will complete this process, we are not sure, of shifting 60% of our total fleet to be engaged in the Asia-Pacific theater. The Air Force, however, is maintaining a number of between 400 and 500, a number that's maintained pretty consistently since the end of the Cold War. But because it's the Air Force and because we can send airplanes out there in hours rather than days or weeks, it may not matter that much.
Of course, though, if you are faced with an invasion, you have to be there quickly. And it would seem to me that one of the Chinese strategies is going to be to strike first and sort of hope that the United States will not be able to get assets in the region. Isn't that right?
Yes. And in the Senkakus, this Chinese strategy that you point out, Gordon, is well underway. They have purchased large hovercraft called the Zuber, or Bison translation. Very large hovercraft designed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It can carry about 150 tons of cargo or personnel. Those hovercraft can get to the Senkakus in about 4 to 5 hours. That's very fast in terms of naval transit. However, the Americans have just put 24 of our MV-22 Bell Boeing Osprey tilt-rotor helicopters in Okinawa. These unique machines can actually transport about 24 of them, about the same amount of cargo, not quite personnel, that one of these hovercraft can carry to these islands in about 1 hour. So if there was a race and the Americans won, we might actually stand a chance of defending these islands. But the Chinese are now working on their own version of the Osprey. It's a development program that has probably been underway for some part of the last decade. There are lots of technical difficulties in building the kind of Osprey tilt-rotor that they're working on with 4 engines rather than 2, but they have money, lots of money, and if they succeed, sometime perhaps around the end of this decade or early in the next decade, that definitely puts a lot of pressure on the Americans in Okinawa and our Japanese allies.
Rick, you just heard General Carlisle speak to the Air Force Association Convention and Technology Exhibition, which just wrapped up yesterday near Washington, D.C. What did Carlisle say that struck you?
Well, there were two main points. First, and this may seem like it was a minor point in the context of his presentation, but before that, let me just say, Hawk Carlisle is a very impressive leader of men, and this is the kind of leader that we should have leading our Air Force in the Asia-Pacific region at this time. But he called the Chinese, there are lots of euphemisms that are used in Washington to describe the Chinese military threat. For most of the last decade, they've been called the peer competitor, kind of a neutral term. Carlisle called them the pacing threat, a not quite so neutral term, but very different nonetheless. But Carlisle also drove home very well the effect of sequestration. In 2012, he was able to undertake 200 engagements with our Asian allies and friends. Anything from a large multinational aircraft exercise down to a small economic engagement where they're training doctors and building schools. All of this is very important in the Asian region because it's so diverse, and you have to do something with everybody in order to keep their interest, affirm the American commitment, and maintain our access. Well, in 2013, this year, the number of engagements was reduced down to 40. This creates a vacuum, and it's my observation that the Chinese are working up to fill this vacuum. They have put together within the last 2 to 3 years their own version of our big, sophisticated red flag exercise, sort of the Air Force counterpart of what we saw in the movie Top Gun. The Chinese are doing this, and for the first time this year, they invited a foreign Air Force. For the first time in the history of the People's Republic, they invited a foreign Air Force to exercise with the Chinese Air Force in China. Pakistan, their closest partner. This will only grow. They will invite other countries. They will probably concentrate on their neighbors in Asia. And that will challenge the engagement strategy of the United States.
Rick, in 1916, 1917, the United States went from 200,000 man army to a 4 million man army and won the First World War. In 1932-33, we were well under 100,000, probably about 50,000, and we went to 21 million by 1945 and won the Second World War. The old saying, I think FDR liked it, we don't start wars, but we finish them. That looks to be the scale of what you're looking at in the Pacific, Rick. It reminds me, we've been here before. We're going to a very small, focused force with a lot of firepower. If the Chinese make a mistake, we'll go to a very big force, and we'll take it all back. Does that feel right to you right now, Rick?
John, no, it does not, because in terms of gross numbers, the Chinese are challenging us.
Right.
By the end of this decade, they will have about 1,000 fourth-generation fighters. That's a huge force. They will have anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 short-range ballistic missiles, an untold number of medium-range missiles, and a lot of tactical nuclear weapons to boot, not to mention submarines, multiple aircraft carrier battle groups, their own large amphibious projection capabilities, and airborne projection capabilities by virtue of their equivalent of the C-17. So if they strike first, they could probably hold the territory. And we don't have 6 months, 18 months, 24 months to mobilize, go back to get it. If the Chinese successfully take over Taiwan or the Senkakus or the Sakishimas, it's going to be a big bloody battle to get them back.
Rick Fisher of the International Assessment and Strategy Center. That Chinese proverb again, just as when striking a snake, first strike it on the head. That works both ways. In the Pacific. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.